Hello, everyone. Welcome to Spelling It Out, a podcast with myself, Julissa Contreras, and the wonderful Catherine Connors. Catherine, this is our first podcast episode together.
I am so excited. I am so excited because we've been talking about this for so long and now we're actually recording it. Go us.
I'm happy to be here and talk about story, which is really our jam. The idea of this podcast, Spelling It Out, is both, yes, the literal spelling of words and getting down to the nitty gritty, but it is also about the invocation that comes with stating things and weaving story together, which is quite literally what spell work is. Bippity boppity boo. We know these tropes, the abracadabra of it all. But how do we look at story as a technology, and perhaps the most powerful technology that we have as humans, as the real invocation, as the real spell that has us topsy-turvy? That story is both the thing that'll save us and the thing that is driving us crazy and dividing us in this moment in time.
We're getting so much wrong about story in this day and age. And I that's not to start us off on a negative note. I actually think it's to start us off on a note of opportunity and also to allow us to say this, that there's a lot that we just naturally get right about story because we are story making and storytelling beings. You and I talk about this a lot over the course of our conversations. It is like the most human thing. It is our most human power, our most human capacity is to make and tell stories. That is to say, to make meaning out of the world by crafting explanations. To your point about what we decided to call this podcast, Spelling It Out, some of that is just what human beings have, we've always done. We have spelled it out. We see something in the world and we create words for it. We create definitions. We create meaning. We craft stories. When you and I talk about story being a technology, and we'll come back to this, it's just pointing at that, this ancient, most human technology of crafting, making, and telling story that we all do naturally in many respects, but that in the age that we're living in, we've turned into a whole industrial complex, right? We've turned it into a machinery, like technology in the weird sense, not technology in the natural sense. We've told ourselves a story. This is a really dominant story that storytelling is something that like is just the domain of a few, that it's something that only the sort of masters of craft can do, and it's only the thing, it's only gets done in Hollywood or New York City or in literary communities. It's become this thing that we've become alienated from. And so for me, I think the number one thing that we get wrong about story is that there is a story that we're following, if that makes sense, right? That the story, the thing that we get wrong about story is the story about story.
I love that as a framing, because I think in getting wrong the story about story, we also get wrong the ways in which self-reflection, accountability, really being present in the moment to what is happening to your life day to day is also the disconnect of a story that is your journey, right? Your hero's journey, for lack of a better word. What is happening in real time? What are you needing? What, sort of signs are you missing, right? That when you are looking at the power of story as something that vibrates, and almost as if we are all born to be storytellers, right? Almost like we are just born to be embodiments of different fractions and connections that come together to make something into being. We have the language and outside of language, just all these mediums of expression that are all story. And so I would say that what we're getting wrong too is where story shows up everywhere and how we're responsible for the ways that we are building these stories, engaging these stories, and also recognizing that just like in storytelling traditionally, there are different genres, that there are different flavors of energies and moments and things that are going to happen in your life that you get to say, that is fiction. That narrative that is trying to form itself in my path is a trap. And I get to see that and I get to treat it accordingly, and that the stories that we create for ourselves to affirm ourselves, validate ourselves, keep the faith are counterspells to these other stories, because story, whether you're using it for good or whether you're using it to deceive people, is powerful. It's creation stories. It's the root of the isms, racism, sexism, ageism, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of these things are narratives. And so for me, we're getting wrong our responsibility as the vessels, as actually the producer of the thing, as actually the one who can build and destroy to such a degree that we have to have better discernment, because the truth is we can't stop these bad story makers, right? And not bad as in poor quality stories that we become addicted to, but really bad storytellers in the sense of they know the power. And so they're going to exploit the technology in very insidious ways. And if we are not tracking their story, their intention, their end goal, we get swept up in so many micro stories and diversions that we lose the plot. And I think right now we're living in a time where we've been losing the plot, but cosmically that feels aligned and necessary in order to ensue change.
Yeah, no, there's a bunch of what you said that I think is so, so important. And I want to come back to this idea of losing the plot and at the meta level, the universal level, and why losing the plot might be the most important piece of the moment that we're in. But I want to come back to what you were saying about this living in a world in which we don't recognize the power of story at the level of magic, right? Like we all like, I think we all understand that stories influence, and we have a word for influencers, right? And thought leaders. And for a very long time, we've been talking about how certain kinds of stories can corrupt children or corrupt adults. And there's a reason why there are certain states in the US that are banning books, right? We recognize the power of stories, but what we don't recognize is the level of magic that that functions at. And I use this very, very deliberately for the same reason you do, right? That it's a power that in some respects kind of defies some of our explanation, right? And you and I sometimes use interchangeably magic and technology. We can come back to why those are effectively the same thing. But we walk around in a world where there are people who are exercising this magic in very powerful ways. They are casting spells with story. We are under the spell of certain stories because they have been cast so effectively, very abracadabra, very bippity boppity boo, wands everywhere. Stories that cast spells also have the counter spell, as you say, that face the reality that we all have this capacity for magic. And there's a couple of things about this that I think we don't think or talk about enough, whether it's in the context of fictional magic or in the real kind of magic that you and I are talking about right now, which is that there's a sort of what I think of as like the Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz problem with magic. It's like we've got the ruby slippers on our feet and we just don't realize it. Like we could click our heels together at any point. We had the magic all along. We weren't using it because we didn't recognize it. So there's that. We do not recognize the magic that we hold to create and craft story and to exert influence and to cast spells and do it ourselves. Right. At the same time, in not recognizing our magic, I think we're less aware that the ways in which that magic gets kind of chaotic, right? That why bad stories matter, why being very conscious about the kinds of stories that we're putting out into the world matter, or the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves, that those matter, that we can deeply influence ourselves and others. And so there's something very important about unpacking all of those magical relationships, both so that we can see it when it's being practiced, at the cultural level, right? And so that we can recognize our own power with it. And so that we can recognize how we are using that power, both in ways that we can accidentally like work against ourselves, and then also in the ways in which can become a powerful, powerful force for positive change.
To that point of being a force for powerful change, right? We think about that and we always think about humanitarianism in some ways. And like, yes, but also positive change can also, to me, mean the ways that the audience in understanding its participation in story, which is for me the act of following the thread of why this story, why now, why this storyteller, why this medium, why this setting, right? Like being able to really ask ourselves, how are we propping up this change making things and in what spaces and for whose benefit, right? Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with being like, it's all just entertainment, for example, right? But then one says, okay, well, if entertainment, then what does that mean? What kind of power does it get to hold? How are we checking its influence so that it doesn't lose its accountability and trying to live in a particular area where we are meant to keep it contained? When it isn't contained, is it intentional? Is it not? If it's not, then what is the provocation of the story teaching us in this moment that we need to respond to? And that is also change. That is change making story. But like, I don't think that we always follow those threads. And admittedly, I think because I've always been a storyteller in some way, whether it's been my poetry, my playwriting, being an actor, podcaster myself, that I've always just understood that there is an industrial complex, going back to what you were talking about before, that is pushing this forward in the biggest way. And it is like the places of places to have your story run through. And that our news stations and cycles also live under this complex. They're not separate, even though they're meant to be true. But if it bleeds, it leads is very much a function that somebody would use in a novel or in any other fictional space, because we know how story pulls at particular heartstrings. And so if story makers know just what to do to get us as audiences to show up in certain ways, then I think it behooves us as audience members to understand their mindset and what are the KPIs, if you will, that they are measuring up against. Because sometimes you have to receive a story, but not receive the spell that's being cast, if you will. Sometimes you need to be able to have your own story straight because you're meant to witness that story to really do something else.
I would take that a step further and say that we are always doing that consciously or unconsciously, right? Like I think that we are never I don't think there's any such thing really as a truly passive audience. We are always co-creating meaning when we engage with story. Even when I will say, like, sort of against my will, come across some piece of news or social snippet about the current president. And even though I might not have sought it out, right? The moment I internalize it, I respond to it, co-creating a story about it in some way, even if it's just for myself. In the 90s, it was sort of fashionable in post-structuralist political theory and literary theory to talk about the death of the author. I mean, it was longer than that. I'm referenced the 90s because that's when I was an undergrad. This idea that there's always an author, there's always a creator of a story, there's always a wielder of the magic, but the people who engage with the story in some way, the person who reads the story, the audience that watches the story or listens to the story is also co-creating in some way. And the less conscious we are, this is my add to this, of our co-creative capabilities, the more likely we are to be moved in ways or swayed in ways that are not necessarily that don't involve our agency, right? And so recognizing that we're actively co-creating this culture of story, I think is a big piece of understanding our responsibility, to your point, right? And also recognizing that how we respond and react contributes to what shows up in the world of story. The things that we click on reinforces the algorithm, reinforces what the media decides. Well, this is the thing that people are interested in, the things that we talk about, the things that we reshare in social contexts. Even you and I deciding to sort of unpack some of these things is co-creating story. And this is not to say, oh, well, this is all this very complex, magical, weirdo web of story. And so who knows what we're doing anyway? It's to say that the most powerful magic that we can exert around story is to be conscious of what it really is.
To me, it's almost like the original atomic bomb that was like blown up. And I'm thinking, and I'll contextualize this around colonization and crusades and just like, and there's many others. I speak to those because that is where my peoples got swept in, right? Like colonization coming in and dropping these bombs of what is and what is not, what is advancement, what is power, what is rich, what is intelligence, even, right? And that the most insidious truth is that the victor telling the story does not put in the part where there were counter stories, there were counter spells that were happening in real time. And then the push of other technology in some ways, or the possession rather of certain technologies ensued a different level of power that was then compounded with the story,
Mhm.
right? But if we allow things to be what they are, the truth, right? Because even the truth tells a story. And I think that that's something that people often don't think. We hear story and we think fabrication, but I would say interpretation, that every story is an interpretation of a truth that is trying to put it together in a way for you to be conditioned in a particular way. And maybe the conditioning is a good thing. Maybe it's like cheering you on and like making you excited, but like it is still, again, an invocation. It is still a spell. So I don't know. It's interesting to me that people even lose sight of how important story is and how easily influenced we can be at times scares me because yes, like stories will always provoke an emotion, but again, this responsibility of how am I allowing the story to move through me is really important. And so that co-creation is also to me something that I want audiences to pay attention to, mostly because right now we're living in a time where we need to be asking these sorts of questions. We are in a moment of interrogation and investigation of new platforms for story, new tools for story. And I feel like this is my ominous way of queuing up AI. We, even yesterday, were talking about how important it has been that we have had the most access to our own storytelling at scale than we ever have ever, which is not to say that we didn't have those practices and community that were storytelling and enriching, absolutely, but that moment and that nuance got, let's say, from Dominican Republic got to reach somebody in China within seconds was not a thing until this recent age. And so there is something about the force function of what story can do that has advanced in a way that, to me, in the same ways with nuclear weapons, we were like, all right, well, now we got to be mindful, because if we can just be dropping stories and narratives and creating now, especially with AI, visuals and things that can fool people into thinking that they're receiving a particular truth, what does that look like? And I'm curious, like, what do you think? I don't even know, to be honest. I'm asking you because I don't know what that looks like, but I think it is the only little bit that makes me stay up at night when I think about the fast growing scale of AI. Not just, oh man, like artist work is being ripped off and it's being replicated, because I hate that already, but that's already been happening in other ways in the way these industries work anyway. And we haven't solved that. But this new layer of, I don't know. I don't know that my tongue and the power of the truth of our tongue will hold any weight. And it feels almost like another wave of truth is going to be erased because the people who have the power of these tools and developing them at the largest scales within these biggest companies, I don't trust them. I don't trust them. I say as I use their platforms, you know?
Yeah. No, and you shouldn't trust them. Here is my hottest take. I can't remember if I've told you this before. I probably have, but we'll drop it here. Here's my hottest take. All stories are lies. All stories are lies. All stories are made up. Story, our storytelling power, our story magic, story craft is literally making shit up. And that's a bonkers amazing thing, right? Like there's we made up concepts of love. Love is a story, time is a story, money is a story, right? Human beings make shit up, right? We lie. And that's not to say, again, this is not to say, and I'll get really nerdy for a second and, talk about like how Plato distinguished between lies. But this is not to say that they're necessarily misleading. It's just to say that they are fabrications. They are fabrications. They are things that we make up. And we make things up sometimes, and this is borrowing from Plato, in order to reveal, right? In order to try to help ourselves get closer to what could be the truth. That we use stories and meaning making and sense making as a way of trying to discover. Like we use them as a tool of curiosity. Plato called these noble lies. They are efforts to sort of direct our souls towards the light, understanding that it's like really hard for us to get there. And it's very hubristic for us to believe that we've gotten there. Like it's a fundamental human error to think that we've gotten things right. The other side of things are what Plato called lies of the soul. And those are the lies that are attempts to misdirect. Rhetoric, right? Propaganda is like, I am just trying to convince you of something, regardless of whether I deeply believe in my soul that there's some like rightness or light to it. And things can get murky between those things. Sometimes we think we're on the side of good and maybe we're not. But there's something about the intention, and this is really, I mean, anybody who's read any fiction about magic, any fairy tales, a sense that like intention is everything. And it is exactly that with story. It's understanding that what we are doing is making things up, that we are inventing, that we are fabricating. And if we are doing it with the intent, like with if I'm doing it out of the spirit of wanting shared abundance and flourishing, that I think is a good thing. That's a noble lie that I'm telling. If it's meant to harm, it's involving harm, then that's a lie of the soul. And I think understanding how that is working on us at all times. We are always being lied to. Is not to say like we are always being tricked, right? It is to say we are a species, we are beings who make things up. And you use the beautiful word discernment, that part of the craft of engaging with that is being discerning, of figuring out, of like being mindful, of being intentional. It's like, why am I being told this story? Does this story serve a higher good for me? Like, who benefits from this story? Whose story is this, right? And it doesn't mean that because it's someone else's story or because the story is trying to convince me of something, it's not necessarily that that's the problematic thing. It's when I don't ask the question. And it's when I don't recognize that I'm doing the same thing right now. I'm trying to convince you, my dear friend, that stories are lies, right? Yes, I'm making my case for it. I could like introduce unicorns and elephants with like pink fairy wings just to like demonstrate my point of like how all this stuff can get like, bonkers. But I mean, it all I think comes down to that is that this is that, especially as we start to walk onto this landscape of having created machine technology that makes shit up, right? That literally makes shit up. I said at a talk I gave this fall that it may be the most human element of AI is that it hallucinates, that it just,
Mm,
if it doesn't have the answer, it just invents something and says, here you go. Let's try this. That in some ways is like the most human thing it could possibly do is just to invent something and like spew it out and pretend that it's true. Because we do that all the time. So this question of what does it mean that now it's not just us making shit up? We've created machine technology that can make shit up, and it's making shit up based on stuff that we've fed it. But it may get to a point where it's just making its own shit up. And so, what does that mean for how we apply our capacities of discernment, right? How we protect our own magic, and even how we ask how much of the human matters. Like how much of this is uniquely human, or are we also just being like, is this a form of species colonialism?
mm.
Right? We're like, we've just decided we're the super super special magic beings, right? And only we get to have this magic, and the cats and the dogs and the machines can't have it because it's ours and it's super special, right? When all that it is magic.
I hear that and I think, man, if we thought we had like the market taken on all story, we're not in relationship with the planet. Trees, like animals in sync. Like the fact that we don't speak the language of the stories that are being told to us is a different thing. For me, the proof is in the way that the world persists and moves forward. And God forbid the worst happens, the planet will persist and like something new will just be born because that story, you know what I mean? Like, is the proof that like one of the stories that we tell ourselves that I think puts us in a position to keep getting story wrong is the story of superiority, right? Whether you are on the right side of things or the wrong side of things, like there is a superiority and this deep desire to use story as a way to preserve that truth in some way, but in the ways that it is true for you. Because as you were speaking, I was like, yeah, every story is made up. Every story is a weaving of people's reality, but people's reality isn't always the truth. And so I will talk a lot about the framework of writing the truth and have taught a few on this. And at the center of this like Venn diagram, there's the truth, but then there's like implicit bias. There is the role that you are playing. There's literal data of like what is like actually the 1 + 1 = 2 of it all, regardless of your opinion. These different areas really do come together, and any responsible storyteller, if you will, knows. And it's not about to be told, oh, well, there's something that is made up in here. And I might be able to say, yes, a story that I write that is representative of my experience or is inspired by my experience is made up of something that is really mine and personal in a way that is not going to represent as true to someone depending on where they're standing in this Venn diagram. It might not be their truth, but it doesn't make it not true. But is the story meant to manipulate? Maybe, but sometimes we're just using story as a modality to reveal truth. Plato talks about being drawn closer to the light, but I think that we are part of that light is truth in a sobering way. And sometimes we use vehicles of fiction and other whimsical things that we can put together, but you're still driving towards a truth.
Yes.
Yeah. So I feel to me, story and truth and like
Mhm.
uncovering mystery through creating mystery in some way is also part of the function of story.
I think it's the core function of story. I think it's the core function of responsible storytelling, right? I love that term. You're exactly right that it's responsible storytelling is on a journey towards the truth. It's curious about the truth. It's seeking. It's not asserting. It's not saying, "Hey, I know something and you don't." It's not putting itself on the pedestal of declaration. I mean, that's a domination mindset. It's a colonial mindset. It's like, we know what's best. And so we're going to impose it. Responsible storytelling, responsible story making, responsible story is exactly that. It's that what Plato called the sort of noble lie or the path of the noble lie, which is like, it might not have the capital T truth, but it's looking for it. Right? It's committed to it, and it's honest and authentic, and it's seeking it. It's putting something forward that is inviting exploration and curiosity, and not trying to shut those down.
Story is a playground for that exploration and curiosity. When you're taken on a journey through a story, it's really, again, as an audience, sometimes you're asked to just sit back, relax, and follow the story along the way. The things that resonate with you, that going back to this idea of the co-creation is, oh, but I actually like the villain, that we naturally start to find resonance, and that in that resonance we then start to co-create a new story, a new meaning of this thing. And this is where fandom comes from, right? The things that some of the biggest franchises are completely made up. You know what I mean? Like Star Wars, Harry Potter, Star Trek, like et cetera, like just completely, but also, and I paused in the mid thought because I was like, it's crazy because this, in the season we've been talking about the idea that there's going to be a Hunger Games here in the United States, or at least what they're referencing to as a Hunger Games. And it's interesting how, like, giving people a story that is ahead of its time, which, we read a Parable of the Sower together in a book club and saw how even the prospects of this fictitious future really started to build a barrier for some of the readers, for others, like this call for preparation and awareness. But how story, even through fiction, like once it starts poking those truths, we start to create an attachment. The more fictionalized something is, or the more further from a particular tangible truth on this plane that it is, the easier we can get lost in it because there is this comfort of the hard truths that live in there, and how we get to like engage them in a way that doesn't feel as sticky and direct as having to just confront truth.
Well, you're making me think about the idea of utopias.
Hmm.
You and I read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler together, which most people would categorize as a dystopia. Hunger Games, dystopia. And it's interesting because there's, there's a term that's become sort of fashionable in the last number of years, protopia, pushback on utopia as something that's impossible. Utopia is as a concept, as an exercise. I mean, Plato's Republic is a kind of utopia slash dystopia. It was always meant to be complicated, right? It was always meant to do exactly what you're describing, right? As a literary exercise versus storytelling exercise. What it was meant to do was explore the choices that human beings make when they're trying to sort of create their ideal circumstances or overcome difficult circumstances, and then look at those very closely and ask ourselves, how are we going to fuck this up? Because we are going to fuck it up somehow. But if we're mindful about it, if we're intentional and we're like, we're thinking on this landscape of the imagination, we're playing with this hypothetical, then we can really explore it. And we can explore all things. Well, we can explore all the like extraordinary possibilities that human beings can imagine. But then we can also explore all the like the risks that are there. And I think that there's something that we've lost in dismissing the idea of the utopia, right? When we say it's, oh, it's just, it's meant to be impossible, the very word means both non or impossible, but also good, right? And I think that there's something about the kind of responsible storytelling that you and I love to talk about, and that is kind of embedded in whether we're talking about fiction or anything that is lacking a kind of utopian impulse, an impulse to imagine what is possible, right? Whether or not we can justify it with science or data or capitalism or whatever domination justifier we have in our toolkit, but because it's worth the exercise and because it's the most magical part of what we do as story making beings is explore landscapes of the imagination and explore spaces that could be radically impossible from the point of view of reasonable adults, whether it's the galaxy far, far away, or it's Hogwarts, or it's St. Thomas More's Utopia. The exercise of imagining matters tremendously because that's exercising our muscles of considering possibility and curiosity, right? Rather than saying, okay, we have the answers, we know, and like we're constrained within these limits, and there's no point in trying unless we know that we can actively build it ourselves right now with the resources at hand, because there's always going to be something that stops that, that pushes against it. And so recognizing that we have this capacity to imagine beyond the possible and make shit up about the impossible and actually begin to play with what it means to make things up, to consider things beyond the possible. That's the thing I think that gets us past and through like these challenging moments, like the one that we're in, where all of the powers that be want us to think it's just this way, right? There's nothing we can do. There's no point in organizing or telling different stories because what are you going to do? There's always something we can do. There's always something we can do. We continue to dream and imagine beyond anything, right? That's why it's the imagination. That's why it's horizons of impossibility, right? It's why, as you and I were discussing just yesterday, we're at this moment in human history where we are doing things like you and I, A, recording a piece of content together that we're going to put out into the public sphere as two women, having the technology to do that, to just decide we're going to do that, to do it at a distance. Our grandmothers would not have imagined but like our greats and our greats and our greats and our great, 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 greats. Like this is sorcery, right? This is pure sorcery. And it's extraordinary and it's powerful. And it required somebody to imagine that it was possible. And it's always story that is at the core of that. Story is always at the start of that. Story is also always at the start of all like the dark things, right? But
Absolutely.
it's also story that's
Yeah.
at the start. And we all have the power of story.
Which is really the call to action for people is like we all have the power of story. It is your mind's eye. It is what you release from your tongue, what you activate your hands to create. It is your power. And it is the only thing that you could rely on to keep yourself grounded and sane and whole, or being able to be so tethered to being clear on what the stories are, so that when, if and when, and I say when, just, being from marginalized communities, it always feels like there's this moment where the dark cloud and the dominant force comes in to really diminish your story. And that happens so often and so easily, just as easily as we can create a story, it can be destroyed. These days, one might argue that distance and lack of influence from outside storytellers who do mean harm meant that societies and groups of people were able to believe something long enough that by the time the disruptive story force came through, they were unshakable in their faith of the story, which is what caused a need to rewrite those stories or to burn those books. It feels like every wave of technology that we have seen throughout history has seen a dark dominant force come in and tap into society's vulnerability, which is the desire to be on top, which is the desire to emulate wealth, right? Everybody has different definitions of wealth, but like there are just these low hanging fruits that humans will fall for. It's like the guaranteed story. Like if you don't think money might tempt somebody, you don't know humans. You don't know the story of humans, right? Or just power in general. If you don't think people are tempted by power, then you do not know the story of the human. And so knowing just those basic truths, and we're living in a data age where I mean, I'm a baby of AIM, MySpace and all that stuff. Since before I even knew my power of story, I have been handing my data to people who get to manipulate the stories around me to sell me shit, to block me from seeing shit, to make sure I see certain shit. An entire lifetime of my story has been given away. And that is true for most of us because even if, and I think about my poor mother who hates that we post her on social media because she's not on social media. And she's like, y'all are placing me in time and space, in a space that I have no interest in being seen or having people have access. I don't want people to know where my outfit was during the holiday. Yeah, I looked cute, but it's my right to my privacy. Like this idea that we not only tell our stories, but we bring everybody's shit to the town square, and that the internet has become that, a town square. But what we don't recognize is that depending on what data and who you are and what time and place, it's different town squares. Like there's actually still much separation, but if we are not following the thread and asking the story questions of like, what is the meta story here, and what character am I in? Am I playing in this larger story? We're gonna keep getting fooled. The creation of StoryQuo and that collective is this idea of saying, all right, well, let's do a couple things. One, there is a narrative industrial complex. There are people who are working in this complex. We are people working in this complex. We are people working in this complex who know the story of how our creations, our stories are being utilized, not for good. Like we've seen it, we've been tracking it for some time. We also see the story makers who, given these algorithms and tools of power that make us compete, that there is a need to create a new story of, all right, well, what does it look like if storytellers are actually Avengers? And while everybody has their own storyline and franchise, that there is a moment or a thing that we coalesce around as story makers across different industries, right? And opening up the definition of storyteller to say, we have to do something. And if all we can do is be an embodiment of a practice of a principle and a belief around story, then we should do that because that is within our story power to do, because story is ours. The reason why I love StoryQuo and the fact that we have this collective is not just that we get to create fun things and get to jam into the minds of people who are story geniuses in their own right and learn and expand, but just that at the end of the day, instead of just bitching and moaning and being afraid of what's happening to story, we are an active counterspell. We are an active space. We are welcoming people who are like, yeah, this shit is fucked up. Get in, loser. Like, we're going in to create some fucking counter stories and be options. And for me, through Spira, which is another creation of ours that is more about self reflection and accountability and looking at community as a tool for validation and affirmation, right? That a lot of times what storytellers really need outside of being fed and financially secure, which is certainly one function of how story makers are lost to the quote unquote other side, is like, I gotta eat. I'm going to write the junk, or I'm just going to give into the shit and I have no choice. Once you can really secure that we are able to, as a collective, do so much change because there's so many different stories and so many different corners of the world that need tending to. That this idea of competing to say, oh, well, I'm the person who has the market on leadership, or I am the person who has the market on a story, or anything, like as storytellers, is actually ridiculous. We want to open it up, and what we want to preserve is, what does the story of leadership or heroes or whatever category you think you have the market on. What is the purpose of that story? Now, how do you work together to preserve the core of the seed? That is how I wish to see storytellers working together. But again, going back to stage one, when you don't have that financial security on lock, it's a lot harder to sit across the table from somebody and say, we can share this. We can actually coexist. We're not actually in competition. Like, we don't have to tell the capitalistic story that makes me feel like, well, let me call a lawyer, your shit's too close to mine, or whatever. Actually, we're coexisting on a larger mission, and we should ask ourselves how these meta stories are affecting the true stories that are wanting to come through us so that we don't lose the plot as storytellers.
And that we not only don't lose the plot, but that we actively weave the new, better plot, right? I mean, I've said this to you a lot that when I think about the possibilities for a Disney for good, right? A next gen Disney that is oriented towards better futures, which is ultimately what I hope StoryQuo could be. Part of that vision is recognizing that what you just said, that all the story magic in the world already exists, all the talent, especially like the skilled craftsperson talent, right? The people who know what they are doing, who are scrabbling for scraps in terms of resources, who are living in the scarcest of conditions while there is an industrial complex, like a narrative industrial complex that is churning, like spending many, many, many millions, sometimes tens, sometimes in the hundreds of millions of dollars to produce mass stories that get associated, even though they take massive amounts of effort by like untold numbers of human beings, are generally associated with one person, right? One auteur, and that completely allied all of the other story magic in the world. Jasper and I yesterday went and saw the latest Avatar movie. Speaking of movies that cost a lot of money, right? Like I'm a recovering Disney executive, so I can tell you a lot about the sausage making. The Avatar series is one of the more costly storytelling projects of the last couple of decades. James Cameron is on movie 3, and it's like, and they're massive visual like extravaganzas. Uh, and so it was interesting. Jasper and I left the movie last night, and Jasper, he's a magical being, and he understands story very deeply. Jasper is my teenage son, and we were talking about how it was really kind of extraordinary visual story, right? And from a sort of broad strokes, kind of Homeric mythic story lens, it's a good, entertaining, good versus evil epic. It completely lacks nuance,
Mm.
right? Completely lacks nuance. And the thing I said to Jasper is like the thing that I struggle with the Avatar movies, this one being the same as the others, is that they they tell this very narrow story about humanity, and a very narrow story about the dynamics of human life. And this is an old story that's been repeated. This is also Lucas. This is the hero's journey, where it's like there is good and there is evil. There are heroes and there are villains. What James Cameron does in the Avatar movies in particular is be like, the villains are super villainy. Like they're bad, bad, bad villainy. They're like hurting the sea creatures, right? There are parts of it that I couldn't watch. And the good guys are like they might be tortured in some ways, and they're probably traumatized, but they're really, really good. And but it's like it's black and white. It's very, very black and white, and it doesn't leave any room for considering an alternative view. And well, on the one hand, I can appreciate that what someone like James Cameron is doing is like we need to be outraged at certain things that human beings do. And I agree, we need to be outraged at many things that human beings do. It feels like such a squandering of cultural resources that I don't know what the budget for the most recent Avatar movie was. It was probably close to, if not over $100 million, a bonkers amount of money that's just associated with one guy, right? Again, doing interesting stuff. He's advanced storytelling technology a lot, like give him his props, but it's condensed all of story magic into this one thing with this one point of view, this one narrow point of view. While to your point, there are so many gifted, visionary, skilled story makers in the world that, and again, this is the point of StoryQuo, that if we were better at sharing resources, if we had come together, then we could tell stories at that scale, not necessarily with that budget. I don't need $100 million, right? To make a single movie, but to really explore the possibilities of story. And that really, if we're thinking about what does a rich, generative, abundant, flourishing future for story technology look like, it's an ecosystem. It's collectives of story makers. It's not just one James Cameron over here, or George Lucas over there, or Kevin Feige over here, whomever. It's almost always a guy, right? Commanding a gajillion dollars to tell the same story over and over again. It's a movement of story makers who share resources and co-create and advance more stories. We don't have to get rid of Star Wars and Marvel. It's just like we need alternatives. We need new stuff. We need to be the Homers of our age. We need to be the people who create the new myths and the new poetry and the new story to keep that magic going in the world and not continuing to squeeze it down, 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 down till it's like just one dark little ball that's being passed from one billionaire to the next that we all just have to follow and hustle for scraps of.
Again, just thinking about the kinds of stories that are often silenced or not platformed in the ways that they could be, or are straight up created, touch the people they need to touch, influence who they need to influence. And once someone sees the spark of that, they then want to pick it out and then industrialize it. I think about all these young black and brown, like TikTok creators, even. Like, I mean, all of history. Like, we can go back in history and just see how things are jacked. But, like, if we're speaking about today, like, the things, the ways in which story makers will do something. And once it glitters, somebody takes it from them to make gold. And even if they do include them in that picking, they put them in an industrious complex that does not preserve the practices of integrity and community that it was created in. And suddenly, that's the narrative of the sellout. Oh, well, you just went and you made all this money and you sell out. And sometimes what drives people in that space is really the desire to scale their story. They see the excitement, blah, blah, blah. And once you really get in there, you recognize the pathways to me being Spielberg or me being James Cameron includes a whole lot of other stories and things that won't budge. And there's a reason why, even when story makers make it to a certain level, there are stories that are so stripped down in their nuance because they're ran through filters of, well, what market is this going to land in? How many viewerships? Like, they go back to data. They go back to this data. They also influence the data to keep it in a particular way. So, like, that wheel makes it really feel discouraging for a lot of storytellers to move forward. But I beg you, I beg you, I beg you, don't give up that power, because this goes back, and I have a thing with being the audience. I don't know what it is. I have a beef with it with myself, but it's a beef that I have. If you, as an audience member, really want to help make change making things and really want to allow the power and potencies of simple things like story to thrive, then you need to know what your investment in these stories actually looks like. And that includes, are we going to go watch these movies? Are we going to go do it? Which is not shaming the Avatar at all, but just saying, like, but what are we watching? Do we go watch Avatar, or do we invest those tickets in a local theater company to go watch a play of a genius voice who is not going to get James Cameron's budget maybe ever in their creative lifetime, but has the story that is going to catalyze you in a way that is undeniably life-changing, that we also rob ourselves of rich stories that storytellers throughout the globe are putting not just their heart, sweat, and tears into, but they are vessels who received a story that needed to be conceived, and they birthed a thing that has been gifted to you in my world, in my stories that I believe, by higher entities and beings and things that are trying to guide the human race all together to a larger story that we are refusing to get. They, remix it, put it in different ways. And in some ways, I believe that religions are all different, like, stories trying to get us to the same truth, right? With different characters and different things to appeal, because just like any good story maker knows, I think a creator or the creators, whatever you believe, know audience just as well as I do. So they are going to funk it up different ways and different angles to make sure that you receive the story. And so what stories am I receiving? we sort of already framed those questions, but like I have to emphasize how important that is because I can create all the magical stories in the world that come to me. And as a human vessel, I'm going to get paid for that through, obliging to the creative gods, if you will, and doing my work. So I know I'm going to get what I need from the stories that I tell. But what I really care to see is for the audiences to also get what they need because I, as a creator, understand my piece of the puzzle and why I need to create it and why you need to receive it. So, for us to honor storytellers in a better way, in a more nuanced way, in a way that isn't about who's more popular and who has more followers, will serve you just as much as it'll serve the dismantling of this industrial complex that rather see you arguing over the Latino or Black representation in Hollywood, which statistics recently got updated and came out, and it was like 1.8, I think, was Latino and 3.3 was Black in the whole fucking industry. And it's like, yeah, and they love that we have something to argue about because we not gonna stop subscribing to their shit. So it just keeps the story alive and going. And it's insidious. I don't like it, but I do appreciate our spaces that we create for creators to get a respite from that and get reignited to get back to their story making purpose because it's more than work, it's a purpose.
I mean, that was core to the whole genesis of StoryQuo, right? It's like one of the best things that we can do to combat that narrative industrial complex, which is its production, its marketing, its audience development, it's all the things, is not just to your excellent point about like that arc of success and wanting to like grab the brass ring when it comes your way, that it's not just about getting different, better stories out in the world from better, different storytellers. It's about creating an entirely new ecosystem of story, creating an entirely new economy of story in which, sure, you can have an avatar, but it's not necessarily even the one you hear about the most,
Mhm.
right? That it is just one piece in a much larger ecosystem of much more diverse, innovative forms of story, not just in forms in the terms of the type of media, but like even the types of story, right? That that requires scaffolding, architecture, economy that's driven by story makers and audiences as co-creators, story communities to want to participate in an ecosystem, right? And to see themselves in it and to see themselves as more than just butts and seats, right? And eyeballs on screens, but as active co-creators of magic.
And as active co-creators, who we are, the stories we tell ourselves, all of that matters. Like to me, the biggest use of the technology of story is personal development.
Yeah.
Because one, as a storyteller, if you're an artist, creator, storyteller, like the more aligned you are to yourself in whatever alignment means to you, like the more aligned and grounded in what you're doing you are, the better. The less that these forces that come to influence you and woo you around the industries that surround your craft, like all that woo doesn't get through when you have a strong foundation that understands the true story. That you get to have faith in, but also that we have to like practice that. And so you can have the best story in the world, but if your practices are shit, then your contributions to society are also creating shitty conditions.
Yeah.
So, like, I think that if there's no other story that anyone feels compelled to engage, counteract, blah, 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 the stories you tell yourself and the stories that make or break your legacy, what you are or are not building are important, whether you're the dude who abides or whether you're the top notch, high performing superhero, whoever, person like Top Gun. It doesn't matter. Like, you have to be aligned to the truth of your story, which really does start by understanding that it is a technology. It is a technology. It is the original technology. It was the first technology and tool and weapon used, just as it has been the wand to repair. Story is everything. Never, ever relinquish the power of story.
Never relinquish it because it's yours. It's ours.
It's yours, it's ours, and it's what has been used to create and destroy. And a lot of the despair that we're feeling in the world and in this moment has everything to do with a story, either one we're holding on to or one that we have not released yet or one that we're afraid to believe because we fear the story behind the result of being wrong.
Yeah.
stories like that is a tool of control. But what are the stories that give you faith? What are the stories that tell you truth and affirm things? Like the creation and receiving of these things matter. That I think is how we get a step closer to changing the world. And I know that's a big statement, but I feel like it is as simple as that. What is the story you following and living? That therein lies the answer for change or growth or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm 100% with you. It's like, amen.
It really does feel like church, like almost a church is a story. I mean, we could, this is why this is a podcast. There's so many subcategories, y'all, we can get into if we want to frame story. And we will be in coming episodes feeling out topics that want us to look at it through different story canons and unpacking what are these stories, how are we showing up for those stories, and why they matter.
Spell it out.
Let's spell it out. Thank you all so much for listening today, and stay tuned for more soon.